Hello and welcome to the AICE Chemistry Lecture Series. Today we're going to look at Chapter 9.4, which is our focus on catalysis and the effects of catalyst on chemical reactions, focusing on the rate of the reaction. So let's get started. Catalysts are a special subsection of chemicals that are going to depend on the chemical reaction. A catalyst can be used to essentially speed up the rate of the reaction. It's a chemical or a substance that when added to a reaction will increase the rate of the chemical reaction, but is chemically unchanged itself. What that means is that if I put 20 grams of a catalyst into a reaction, the rate of the reaction will speed up, but at the end of the reaction, once it's done, I will still have the 20 grams of the original catalyst that I put in. That's what we mean by it's chemically unchanged. It does not actually change the catalyst itself, but the presence of the catalyst is going to speed up the reaction. It provides a different mechanism for the reaction to happen. The mechanism of the reaction is essentially how the reaction happens. We'll, in A-level chemistry, go a lot more in depth into mechanisms and what they are, but for now, just know that it is the clockwork, the pieces of how the reaction itself occurs from reactants to products. So what the catalyst does is that it provides a separate mechanism, a different mechanism through which the reaction can happen, and that mechanism has a much lower activation energy than the original mechanism for the reaction. Now, the catalyst does this by not ever being consumed, but its presence itself provides the alternate mechanism. Now, because catalysts change the rate of the reaction, according to the collision theory, they have to do so by somehow altering the number of molecules that lead to, or the number of collisions that lead to successful collisions. So we can see the effect of a catalyst both in the energy level diagrams and Boltzmann distribution of a reaction. Let's start with the Boltzmann distribution. Now, the shape of a Boltzmann distribution when we add a catalyst does not change. Remember, the only thing that's going to change the actual graph for the Boltzmann distribution, as we discussed in 9.3, is the temperature the reaction is happening at. What the catalyst does is that because it provides a different mechanism with a lower activation energy, that vertical line that represents the activation energy on the x-axis of the Boltzmann distribution gets moved towards the left. Because a catalyzed reaction, one with a catalyst in it, is going to have a lower activation energy than the same uncatalyzed reaction without the catalyst. So the only thing on the Boltzmann distribution that changes with the catalyst being added is that the activation energy gets shifted towards the left, and that line therefore gets shifted towards the left, lowering the activation energy. What that ends up happening, which you can see in this Boltzmann distribution here, is that we get a higher proportion of the particles being after the activation energy, which means more of those reactions will lead to successful collisions. So essentially what we see here is that for the uncatalyzed reaction, let's say maybe 20% of the graph lies beyond the activation energy. So 20% of the collisions will lead to successful collisions. But maybe for the catalyzed reaction with the catalyst, because that activation energy moves down, this area is past the activation energy is now higher, maybe 40% of the total number of collisions will lead to successful collisions, because now that area past that activation energy is much larger. And so more molecules have enough energy to overcome the activation energy, more kinetic energy. So that's what a catalyst does when it comes to the Boltzmann distribution. It does not change the shape of the graph. It simply shifts the activation energy of the Boltzmann distribution towards the left. It lowers the activation energy, which is the role of the catalyst. In an energy level diagram, what it does is that it lowers that hill. It provides an alternate mechanism which has a much lower activation energy. Remember that for an energy level diagram, the activation energy is the distance between the reactants and the highest point in the hill. or what we call the activity complex, which is up here. So this is the black line represents the energy level diagram for the uncatalyzed reaction. That activation energy is much larger than for the red line, which represents the catalyzed reaction, the one with the catalyst. What this does that this reaction happens in a different manner. This new manner with the catalyst having a much lower activation energy. And so what that does is that because the activation energy is lower, more of those molecules are going to undergo the reaction per second than with the higher activation energy. And so the catalyzed reaction, the one with the catalyst, will happen more quickly. The rate of the reaction will be much higher thanks to the lower activation energy that we see here in the energy level diagram. Now, sometimes you will see this as the new mechanism having multiple steps. So I'm going to show you an example. I'm going to draw another example of that. So for the energy level diagram, what we might see is that we have a mechanism. So I'm going to draw it in pink for the uncatalyzed reaction. So we're going to have the reactants. And then we're going to have the uncatalyzed reaction drawn. Let me draw that a little more steeply. So we're going to have the uncatalyzed reaction to the products. So pink means uncatalyzed. No catalyst there. Now in blue, what we might see sometimes, and sometimes it will be like the one we're just looking at, sometimes it might show the catalyzed reaction as having multiple steps in the mechanism. So you might also see something like this, where there are multiple hills for the catalyzed reaction. And that's fine. That is just another way of showing a mechanism with multiple steps. We're not going to get into what that means because that's A-level material. But having this essentially is the same thing. If I were to label the activation energy for the uncatalyzed reaction, the activation energy will be from the highest point to the reactants as per usual. So this is E8. For the catalyzed reaction, the activation energy will still be from the highest point in the mechanism, which is this one, not this one because it's lower, this one, to the reactants. So that activation energy will be here. But it's the same thing. So whether it has multiple hills like this one, which essentially shows a mechanism with multiple steps, a reaction mechanism with multiple steps, or whether it has a single hill, like the one we were seeing here, it means the same thing. The activation energy is lower in the catalyzed reaction with the catalyst than in the uncatalyzed reaction. So that's what catalysts do in the Boltzmann distribution and in the energy level diagram. So there are a few different types of catalysts, right? Their main two types of catalysts are homogeneous and heterogeneous catalysts. And this, for the most part, is going to be some vocab. A homogeneous catalyst, now catalyst is a catalyst, right? It speeds up the rate of the reaction, does not get used up. But the difference between the two are the states of matter, or what we call the phases of matter. A catalyst that is homogeneous has the same phase of matter as the reactants. And it works by an alternate pathway, so it creates a different way of the reaction happening. Now, why is it the phase of matter and not the state of matter? Phases of matter are a little different than states of matter. For states of matter, we all know we have, for the most part, solid, liquid, and gas. And sometimes in there, even though it's not technically a state of matter, we'll throw aqueous. Even though aqueous is not a state of matter because it's a mixture, aqueous just means something dissolved in water. And that is classified technically under states of matter as a different state of matter. A phase of matter, however, is a little more broad. With phases of matter, we still have solid, liquid, and gases. But under phases of matter, liquid and aqueous are classified as the same phase of matter. So whether something is liquid or is aqueous, we essentially consider the two to be the same phase, whereas solid and gas are different phases. Unlike with states of matter, where the aqueous is technically either a different state of matter or not a state of matter at all. So that's why we use the term phase. It's a little more freeing, it's a little more general, with liquid and aqueous meaning the same or being the same phase of matter. So a homogeneous catalyst is going to be in the same phase of matter as the reactants. So, and a perfect example of a reaction that can actually have a bunch of different catalysts is the reaction of the decomposition of hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide, when left alone in sunlight, will decompose very slowly to water and oxygen. So the hydrogen peroxide slowly turns into water and releases oxygen gas. Well, this reaction can be catalyzed by a number of different catalysts. One of them is iodide ions, I- aqueous ions. So this could be from a solution of potassium iodide, sodium iodide, something like that. When we add potassium iodide or sodium iodide, some kind of aqueous iodide ion solution to peroxide, it decomposes into water and oxygen a lot more quickly. You might have seen this done before because this is the classical reaction that we use for elephant's toothpaste, which I will do in class later this week. So it's a reaction for elephant's toothpaste, which quickly decomposes hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen at a much faster rate than it originally happens at. This iodide ions are homogeneous catalysts. Why? Because the iodide ions are in the aqueous phase, and so is the hydrogen peroxide. Even if you were to use something that was liquid, it would still be considered the same phase as the aqueous, as we discussed earlier. So this is a homogeneous catalyst for this reaction. Essentially what the iodine does is that normally the peroxide would decompose by itself. The catalyst essentially gives it a place to happen and gives an alternate pathway for that reaction to happen. On the other hand, we have heterogeneous catalysts, which, as you can imagine, is the exact opposite. Hetero meaning different. Heterogeneous catalysts are a catalyst that is in a different phase of matter than the reactants. And it works through a process called absorption. So that same reaction of peroxide can actually be done with manganese dioxide, MnO2. When peroxide is exposed to manganese dioxide, which is a solid, it still decomposes into water and oxygen, and it does it at a much quicker rate than normal. This is the reaction that we normally do for a demonstration called the genie in a bottle demonstration. I'm going to do that later this week as well. So the manganese dioxide is actually a heterogeneous catalyst because the manganese dioxide is a black powder. It is in the solid state. When we add it to the peroxide, which is aqueous, we do so in that solid state, meaning that it's acting as a heterogeneous catalyst because the state of matter or the phase of matter of the peroxide is not the same as the phase of matter of that catalyst. So this works through a process called adsorption. We're not going to go too much into detail in AS chemistry because we go a lot into detail on this in A-level chemistry. But the process of adsorption essentially means that the reactant molecules are going to attach themselves to the surface of the heterogeneous catalyst, which is why most heterogeneous catalysts are solids. And then the reaction happens on the surface of the catalyst, and then those products will detach themselves and float away. So that's a process of adsorption with a D, not to be confused with absorption. Absorption, like a sponge, is when things go inside of something, whereas adsorption with a D, not with a B, is going to be when things attach to the surface of something, like the reactant particles do to the solid heterogeneous catalyst here. So homogeneous catalysts act through alternate pathways, whereas heterogeneous catalysts act through adsorption. Homogeneous catalysts have the same phase of matter between the catalyst and the reactants, whereas heterogeneous catalysts have different phases of matter between the catalyst and the reactants. Now, I should say there is one more type of catalyst, and those are biological ones. Biological catalyst refers to large molecules created by biological creatures, whether it's animals or plants or humans, that act as catalysts for reactions happening within the organic and living creature. So enzymes are what we call biological catalysts. They're made up of one really large protein, which are very specific to certain reactions and work based on their shape. Now, a protein, a large protein that is an enzyme, has what we call an active site, which is the spot on that enzyme where the catalysis happens. So these very large molecules that are proteins, that are enzymes, have a very specific shape. That shape has a particular piece of it where the chemicals for the reaction, the reactants for the reaction, are going to fit. We call that piece the active site. The chemicals that fit into that active site are called the substrates. So the substrate, which are the chemicals that are the reactants for the specific reaction that the enzyme catalyzes, are going to fit perfectly into that active site. So again, active site is the spot on the enzyme where the catalysis happens. The substrates are the specific molecules that fit into that active site. And then once those fit together, the enzyme is able to catalyze the reaction, make it happen a lot faster, and then the products can escape the enzyme. A perfect example of this is that same reaction we saw earlier, that decomposition of hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen. There is an enzyme in your body that can help that reaction happen. That enzyme is called catalase. Catalase is a reaction, and actually I think this is an S, not a Z. I am not the best with spelling. Catalase is an enzyme, a large protein, that catalyzes the reaction for the decomposition of hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, into water and oxygen. And this is what keeps essentially you alive if you ever consume any kind of hydrogen peroxide or other peroxides, because the catalase in your blood will and in your cells will break down the hydrogen peroxide. This is also the reason why when you put hydrogen peroxide on a wound, on a cut, where enzymes have been broken open, that wound starts to bubble. That bubbling is the oxygen gas that is created by this reaction. And that is the biological catalyst that we call enzymes. And that's it. That's everything you need to know about catalysts for AS chemistry. And that is it for section 4 of chapter 9. And also that is it for chapter 9. The only other thing that we'll do is obviously talk about that lab in class, which is the rates lab for paper 3 for the practical. That's it for this video. Thank you for joining, and I see you next time.